So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're taking a quick look at part of a live stream that Team Standing for Truth did with Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. Thankfully for me, Standing decided to clip some 10 minutes of it and upload it as a separate video, saving me from having to sift through hours of drivel in order to find something worth responding to. So on the one hand, thanks SFT, you made this a bit easier. On the other hand, well, I'm rather annoyed. You see, in the wake of my so-called debate with Mr. Batman, I was sent a screen grab of SFT claiming in a live chat that he thought I was correct that birds were dinosaurs, taxonomically speaking. I don't have that screen grab, unfortunately, but I was not the only one who saw it, as is evidenced by this conversation between Gutsick Gibbon and SFT. So, I was rather shocked to find that in this video, SFT decided to simply pretend he'd never said that, nor had he heard my opening statement at that debate. As you'll see, Sarfati here says things that I know SFT simply knows is bull, and he makes no attempt to question or give pushback on things he thinks helps his case, but which he knows are wrong. And that is deeply dishonest. So I'm calling you out, SFT. Fix your You are associating with known academic frauds. This is borderline academic fraud. You are associating with people who have issued what can easily be seen as veiled death threats. Let me spell this out to you. You are being dragged down not only by your own behavior, but by your continued uncritical association with people who are deeply disturbed and disturbing, and who make you look worse than I suspect you are. You need to clean house, then do an internal audit to see if you can come at these discussions with at least the illusion of intellectual integrity. You may have noticed that fewer people on the side of science are willing to show up to your events. There's a reason for that. Your behavior and that of your associates in the brain trusts is disgusting. As is that of your guest Sarfati, who, as we will see, knows nothing about what he is talking about. Anyway, let's see what nonsense a chemist has to spew at us about dinosaurs.
I find a lot of times there are the different camps within the evolutionary community are arguing against each other. And I've noticed you point that out in your books, Dr. Sarfati, including, I think, Refuting Evolution, where you are pointing out that they're both wrong.
What do you know? There's debate in science. No one denies that. That is always the case. Science proceeds by settling old questions and then asking new questions. For example, the question of common ancestry has been settled for more than a century now, with resounding affirmation of common ancestry of all life. It is now at the same level as universal gravitation, that germs cause infectious diseases, that the Earth is round, or that chemicals are made of atoms and ions. But in each case, there are unsettled questions. For example, exactly what branch of reptiles do turtles fall onto? How does gravity work at the quantum scale? How do cancers become infectious in some cases? How does the shape of the Earth interact with local variations in gravity? How can we work out a general algorithm for protein folding? These are all open questions, and when they are solved, they will present new questions. There is no worth in pointing out that scientists disagree on the fringe of a known science in an effort to discredit well-established science. It's just a dishonest rhetorical trick. And dishonesty is kind of a theme with creationism, because, as Aaron has rightly said, honest, well-informed, creationist. Pick two. Although I'll add that you can also be only one.
I think one example I use is, for instance, you got the origin of birds that had happened from the ground up the cursorial running theory of running dinosaurs evolving flight, ordered to happen from gliders coming down from the tree, right. The arboreal theory, and both of them actually raise very devastating arguments to the other side. And I think both the objections are right. Both sets are right.
Yeah, that's an open question in the evolution of true birds from among the Paravian dinosaurs. And just like with any proposed course of evolution, there are challenges. But pointing that out does nothing to attack the consensus that birds did in fact evolve from other dinosaurs. This is like observing some football fans arguing whether or not Von Miller should have been the Super Bowl MVP in Super Bowl 50 in 2016, and then concluding that because people might in good faith disagree on that the Denver Broncos were not in fact the winners 24-10. There you go. I too can do a sports analogy with the best of those evangelical pastors.
That birds didn't evolve from dinosaurs, they didn't evolve from tree dwellers, they didn't evolve in the first place.
Well, in fact, they did. And at this point, the tree dweller hypothesis is becoming stronger. For instance, we have some reason to think that some dinosaurs closest to birds had some arboreal tendencies, such as Scansoriopterigids and the Microraptorine dromaeosaurs. That doesn't discount the ground-up hypothesis, but it's a strike against it. And once more, arguing about who should have won MVP doesn't change the score.
Well, it's really, really common now, Dr. Sarfati. You might have noticed it now, too. The evolutionists are just pretty much saying that birds are dinosaurs.
Oh, yes.
Is there any validity to the way they just kind of assert that like it's a fact?
Well, this just comes down to what I would call ignorance of the law of monophyly, but since I know SFT knows better, he's just setting up a dishonest softball for Sarfati to knock into a straw man. It is a tautology to say that birds evolved from dinosaurs, therefore they are dinosaurs. Evolving from a group is the same as belonging to a group. They are just different ways to say the same thing. You evolved from apes, you are an ape. All your descendants, until your bloodline dies out, hopefully in the far future, will be apes. No matter how much evolving they may or may not do. Similarly, they'll always be vertebrates. Let's define some terms in terms of phylogenetics. A taxon is simply a category of organisms that humans have identified as a group and named. A taxon can be monophyletic, paraphyletic, or polyphyletic. Generally, when scientists find out that a taxon is anything but monophyletic, they add or remove organisms such that the taxon becomes monophyletic. Or in some cases, they simply ditch the taxon. So in the long run, the only valid taxa are those that are monophyletic. So what do these terms mean? Well, monophyletic means that the taxon includes all the descendants of a single common ancestor as well as that ancestor. And since you can't change your ancestry, you by definition belong to all of the monophyletic taxa that your ancestors did. What about paraphyletic? Well, that would be all the descendants of a common ancestor except for one or more groups. For example, if Dinosauria is thought of as excluding birds, it becomes paraphyletic, because the common ancestor of Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus is the same as the common ancestor between Triceratops and an ostrich. Okay, well what about polyphyletic? Well, that just means that the supposed members of the group actually share common ancestors with more than one group that are closer than those they share with some of the other members of the group. For example, if you were to include crocodiles as dinosaurs, but not pterosaurs, that would make Dinosauria polyphyletic, because crocodiles are much more closely related to alligators than they are to, say, Velociraptor, and Velociraptor is much more closely related to Pteranodon than it is to crocodiles. So we're not including alligators or pterosaurs. Okay, so now that we know we're about to hear some nonsense from Sarfati that violates the very basics of how evolutionary biology works, let's hear him out.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of differences between dinosaurs and birds. You see, if you look at the hip bone of a dinosaur, there's a hollow there. Where the three hip bones they fuse is called the acetabulum. That's where the femur goes in, articulates. And in dinosaurs, uniquely, they have a hollow thing there. Well, other creatures, it's a solid, it's shaped like a vinegar cup. It's called the acetabulum, which means little vinegar cup in Latin. You see, that's so every other thing has a solid thing there. It's a cup-shaped thing. Dinosaurs have a hole there. That's one big difference.
Well, he's right that dinosaurs have an open or extensively perforate acetabulum, and since dinosaurs have it, so do birds. Let's see some, shall we?
Another one is that dinosaurs have their center of gravity on hind legs because they're very good runners. In fact, that's what natural selection would select for, is being the best runner you have, which means you have to have the most muscle mass there. While birds have most of their muscle mass in their upper body for their flight.
In fact, All theropods balance at the knees, birds included. That's why bird femurs are subhorizontal, rather than near vertical as you might see in Tyrannosaurus, because as some dinosaurs became more and more adapted for flight, they got more and more top-heavy. So they pulled their legs up at the knee and kept that balance point. But as you can see in the following clip, if you put an artificial weight on their back end, birds suddenly just start walking like an Allosaurus. So this supposed difference is just another commonality between birds and other theropods. I'll also note that Sarfati is just dead wrong when he says that dinosaurs balance at the hind legs. Go look at a titanosaur and tell me that their center of gravity is over their hind legs. There's a reason they walk on all fours, and it's specifically because their center of gravity is too far forward to do otherwise. What Sarfati should have said was that theropods balance at their hind legs, and specifically their knees.
So you can't go from this bottom-heavy creature to a top-heavy creature. It's a major anatomical change.
It's literally just a change in the at-rest position of the femur. That's it.
And then you got things like the feathers themselves. I mean, feathers are an incredibly well-designed thing. You got the barb, and you got the central shaft, and you got barbs, you got hooks and ridges that connect it to make a flight surface. I mean, the feather itself is a different thing.
Okay, here are some non-bird dinosaurs with asymmetric feathers. What's the point? And of course, SFT knows better because he's seen my opening statement from the Are Birds Dinosaurs debate with Mr. Batman that includes these two slides, both of which feature animals that are not birds but have asymmetric feathers, namely Anchiornis and Microraptor. And I'll remind you that Microraptor is a dromaeosaur, the same family of dinosaurs as Deinonychus and Velociraptor. It is emphatically not a bird.
And even the lung structure is different because the dinosaurs presumably had a bellows-type lung, but the birds have a flow-through type lung where the air goes in one direction, the blood vessels go in the opposite direction. It's called counter-current exchange, very efficient, but it's a very different design from what reptiles had. And how do you go from one to the other? Because the intermediate stage would have to have a hole in the lung. It's called a diaphragmatic hernia, and that would not be very good for the animal.
I love that little wow that gets tossed in there from SFT. And here's why. He's seen my opening, which included this slide. He knows this is bullshit. So first, I want to ask the good, chemist, who's talking about comparative anatomy, for some reason, what kind of breathing does a reptile have? Because I don't think he knows that there is no single answer to that question. Crocodilians have a pseudo-diaphragm attached to the liver, and they use muscles attached to the liver to drive breathing in a system called a hepatic piston. But lizards and snakes simply use muscles attached to their ribs to expand the rib cage laterally. Turtles rely on muscles surrounding the lungs, as well as muscles on the floor of the lower jaw to move air into and out of the lungs. On the other hand, we note the avian-style respiratory system with air sacs filling the thoracic cavity, neck, and even the bones actually goes farther back than dinosaurs, since pterosaurs also have that system. And we have even found it in Majungasaurus explicitly. So, far from this kind of lung system being a difference between reptiles and birds, it's a system that birds share with more reptiles than just dinosaurs. It seems like it's ancestral to Ornithodira, with pterosaurs and dinosaurs as well as their close relatives.
Because natural selection can't tell you, well, in a million years, you're going to be a bird.
Right.
Right, deal with what you got now. What you've got now is a diaphragmatic hernia, and you're going to die.
No, but it can tell you that you can be more active for longer with more blood oxygenation, and it can tell you that little air sacs off the lungs that are automatically expanded and contracted by limb movements that the animal was already using to run around can help with that. It can also tell you that some of the ways of putting blood through the lungs are more effective than others. And then, boom, you're on your way to avian-style respiration. From there, it's just a matter of expanding the role of the air sacs, allowing the lungs to become more rigid. More blood oxygenation is better than less, even if you're not flying. And at no point do you have a diaphragmatic hernia, because reptiles don't have diaphragms. I want to say this loud and clear to all the creationists out there. If you think anything but mammals or their relatives have a true diaphragm, you are too ignorant of comparative anatomy to have this conversation. Go away, learn some anatomy, then come back. I am tired of creationists inventing diaphragms where they do not belong. You as a human are not the template for all life, or even all tetrapods. Fix yourselves, do better, be better.
Yes, so there are a few things there. I mean, in fact, Joel Taylor and I are writing that dinosaur book we're talking about, and we've got 2 chapters on the dinosaur bird issue. One is on the general theory, the others are looking at some of the candidates they bring up. And Dr. Brian Thomas from ICR and I wrote a paper on this as well, pointing out the differences.
Well, if your paper included arguments like this, I can only imagine it was met with laughter among the scientifically literate who are well read on the issue of avian ancestry or anatomy.
By the way, I'm not saying that the Bible tells you there aren't any feathered dinosaurs. I'm not saying that because the Bible doesn't tell you that much.
Right.
Who cares what the Bible says about dinosaurs? The Bible says you can get stripy cow babies by having their parents drink near stripy sticks. Let's get this clear. If you want to get your spiritual guidance from the Bible, then have at it. I won't stop you. I won't even dissuade you. But the second you put the Bible over science, we have a problem. What science has to say is 100% independent of anything in the Bible. The Bible, in no rational thought process, is prior to bare reality. And where reality and the Bible contradict, the Bible has to go, or at least your interpretation of it that conflicts with reality has to go. Any scientist who started a paper with reference to the Bible in anything but a paper about the Bible and associated literature should be immediately fired for academic fraud, because that means he has set his conclusion before he approached the data, and that is dishonest.
Okay, so there may well be a feathered dinosaur. I'm just not convinced by the usual the candidates they put up, and I certainly don't believe that birds evolved from dinosaurs. That's not true at all. They're definitely separate creations.
Here's a quote candidate for a feathered dinosaur. Seems pretty cut and dry to me. What Sarfati means by "I'm not convinced" is, I refuse to be convinced despite overwhelming evidence because it makes my position less rhetorically forceful.
And you brought up so many phenomenal points. I'm glad that we actually touched on that because you do hear that all the time. And what you just said was great. It brings me to a video that you and Dr. Carter released. I think it might have been a couple weeks ago that I recommend everybody watch. I like what you said there in that the Bible doesn't really say one way or another if dinosaurs had feathers, but you personally, who it really sounds like you've dug deep into this issue, you're not convinced then, Dr. Sarfati, that the examples they purport really are that of feathered dinosaurs.
I might take a look at that video later, but right now I'm responding to this specifically because I know SFT knows better and I am sick of him lying, whether by commission or as here by omission. If you think you'd like me to take a look at that video by Sarfati and Carter, let me know in the comments. If there's demand, I'll give it a go. I'm sure it'll be stupid, but then that's what I do.
Well, I mean, we've got some dinosaurs which we've got to, they're so well preserved, which goes back to the flooders of reality. Some dinosaurs are so well preserved, we have the skin, and the skin has scales. We can tell what shape the scales are. Not feathers, it's quite clearly scaled skin.
Man, scales. Too bad birds don't have those, right?
Right.
So
yeah,
we do have them, and then you have things which are probably collagen fibers, and then you find the same sort of thing on pterosaurs and dolphins, which clearly did not have feathers. So if we can have the same things on non-feathered creatures, we shouldn't necessarily be jumping to the conclusion that there were feathers on the dinosaurs.
And once again, SFT knows why these cannot be collagen fibers. Collagen fibers do not have melanosomes, but feathers do. These things have melanosomes. In fact, we can even tell what kind of melanosomes they are, and I know SFT knows this because he has seen my presentation on it where I included this slide. As for pterosaurs, well, we know they were fluffy because they are preserved with branching pycnofibers, and whether or not these are feathers is actually an open question, so maybe they did. As for the supposed collagen fibers in ichthyosaurs, those are neither collagen nor feathers. They're tool marks, made by the fossil preparators more than a century ago. They're literally not part of the fossil.
Here's a question that came in. People are loving your answer to the birds or dinosaurs. I think it's something people need to hear about. I'm not 100% certain about a feathered dinosaur paper.
Oh, I know what he's talking about. It's interesting, though, that this McLean feathered dinosaur paper published in the ICC was...
This McLean paper is Feathered Dinosaurs Reconsidered, New Insights from Baraminology and Ethnotaxonomy by Matthew McLean, Matt Petrone, and Matthew Spites, published in 2018 in the Proceedings of the International Conference on Creation. From page 2 of the ICC's author manual, we get this wonderful phrase. Proposals dealing with the age of the Earth/universe must come from a young Earth perspective. Proposals from an old Earth, local flood, geocentric, anti-relativity, or anti-quantum mechanics perspectives will not be considered for these proceedings. So, there you go. The entire journal is a fraud. And further, all Sarfati does is whine that the paper disagrees with his, but doesn't directly address his. Of course, by Sarfati's own logic, this young Earth creationist infighting means that young Earth creationism isn't true. But of course, reaching that conclusion would require intellectual honesty, which is in short supply among people like flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, and young Earth creationists. I'm not going to include his whole whinge about McLean at all. It's irrelevant to anything I care about.
Now,
I'm looking from people like Alan Fiducia, who's written a whole thing about feathered,
Right.
a whole book on feathered dinosaurs and why they don't work. That was ignored.
Fiducia is ignored because he ignores the evidence and has been backed so far into a corner at this point that he is basically claiming that animals like Velociraptor were birds. In fact, flightless birds that had flying ancestors. He is a crank and one of the last holdouts of the birds are not dinosaurs band, a position that will die among evolutionary biologists when he and his friends die. Then who will creationists quote mine to pretend birds are not dinosaurs? Well, of course we know it'll still be Fiducia, because even a century after his death, those spicy quotes will still be fresh enough for a creationist.
would you?
The leading experts in actual fossil birds, the paleoanthropologists, no, paleoornithologists, they seem to be quite skeptical of the feathered dinosaur idea. As non-ornithologists who seem to be pushing the feathered dinosaur idea.
Nope. Fiducia and company are trailing paleoornithologists at this point. That wasn't always so, but then they decided to start ignoring evidence and have been relegated to the loony bin with electric universe proponents, flurfs, and creationists.
Right. Well, because even now they're depicting, we all know Jurassic Park and the Tyrannosaurus Rex, but now you see depictions of Tyrannosaurus just as a big feathered dinosaur. It looks totally different than past interpretations. So would you say that a lot of that is inference, assumptions, and not really based on empirical science?
Okay, this is something creationists do all the time. They equate scientific inference and assumption with just blind stabs in the dark. An assumption in one part of science is a conclusion from another part of science. So for example, if you're trying to calculate the impact energy of a hypothetical meteor colliding with Earth, you assume the gravitational pull of the Earth. Not because you were just guessing it, but because other parts of science have already worked it out, and there's no point in you doing those experiments and mathematics over again. An assumption in science is just the stuff you start out with in your work that you're not going to bother to justify yourself, because that work was already done, often centuries ago. Chemists aren't out there trying to demonstrate atomic theory before they get their own experiments going. Inference is when you use your own conclusions and assumptions, which again are already conclusions from prior science, to predict future data. So let's look at the feathery T-Rex idea. So assumption 1. T-Rex is a Coelurosaur. We know this from previous work on Tyrannosaurus and the wider Coelurosauria. Assumption 2. Coelurosaurs from a wide range of taxa within Coelurosauria were feathered to varying degrees. Inference. T-Rex may have had some feathers. Both assumptions are conclusions from prior work in taxonomy and paleontology. The inference is reasonable, but not known for sure. There are also reasons why T-Rex may not have had feathers, or only had them when young, or only had a few feathers. But the fact that this idea of a feathered T-Rex is based on assumption and inference is in no way a strike against it. That's called doing good science.
Well, especially when I think have found some impressions of Tyrannosaurus skin. I mean, I think when the skin's quite clearly scaly, I think that's going a bit far.
Right, that's a good point.
No, it's not a good point, because unfortunately the skin impressions we have of T-Rex do indeed show small reticulate scales, the same kind we find on birds, but they're also from exactly the places T-Rex is least likely to have scales, that is, the thighs and underbelly. Now, there are some reports of skin from the back of the neck that are scaly, and if that turns out to be true, then T-Rex was probably not feathery at all, but all that means is that a reasonable but still tenuous hypothesis has been overturned.
So the reason why maybe they're ignoring some of those arguments is because they don't have a really solid rebuttal to it then.
It's quite possible, yeah. I mean, we've actually said, well, okay, how about you find a creature that has an open acetabulum, a perforate acetabulum it's called, but also has unequivocal feathers. Find that for us. I mean, we're not saying that the Bible doesn't rule those things out. We said that in our paper. I've said it with the video with Dr. Carter that you talked about. But find one. I mean, don't just say it's possible. Tell us that it actually is actual, not just possible.
While I know that this is actually a challenge for his creationist opponents, here's some acetabula from animals with unequivocal feathers. And yes, that's the same montage as before.
So that means I'm gathering that when they point to like so-called transitionals like Archaeopteryx, Sinopteroc, maybe I'm butchering that one. Are these just true birds then, or what would be the
Archaeopteryx is a true bird? I mean, had see the things about true birds they have. I mean, Archaeopteryx had a full flying wing. It had flight feathers, which are asymmetrical, just like flight feathers should be.
Well, Microraptor also had flight feathers and wings, but it wasn't a bird. So having wings doesn't make you a bird. Indeed, we even know that Velociraptor had primary and secondary feathers like a bird, although we don't know if they were asymmetrical.
It had a movable maxilla. You know, you've got a mandible, the lower jaw. Your maxilla is just part of your skull, but the birds have a movable maxilla, the upper jaw as well, and the Archaeopteryx had that.
So the last paper I could find on this subject, and one of the only ones, was New Observations on the Skull of Archaeopteryx by Oliver W.M. Rauhut, published in a German journal I won't even try to pronounce the name of. But the conclusions were that not only did Archaeopteryx almost certainly not have significant cranial kinesis, but that even previous ideas that it did were always speculative. Okay, but what the heck is cranial kinesis anyway? It's not exactly an everyday term. Look at a parrot eating. Notice that the top jaw doesn't stay fixed relative to the rest of the cranium. That is because the bones connecting the maxilla and hence premaxilla to the rest of the cranium are thin and flexible. This allows muscles attached from the cranium to the maxilla to pull the upper jaw up. In this picture, you can see the thin attachment of these bones. Now let's look at an Archaeopteryx skull. Now, unfortunately, all our specimens of Archaeopteryx do not have great skull remains, but this is a reasonable reconstruction. One thing I want you to notice is the maxilla is rigidly attached to the jugal and nasal bones, which oppose each other in exactly the directions the maxilla would need to bend to produce avian cranial kinesis. The skull will not bend the way a parrot's would. Now, to be fair, parrots have way more kinesis than most birds. I just used them to make it clear what this is.
So there's again the head, the skull, even its sensation organs of a bird, its flight feathers of a bird. It also had a perching foot too. So you could tell from the claws that it had a perching foot. It was a perching bird, not a feathered dinosaur.
Well, at one time it was thought that Archaeopteryx had an inverted hallux like a modern finch. We know that this was a taphonomic artifact, and that no, the hallux of Archaeopteryx was placed medially and could not oppose the other toes to perch. Archaeopteryx would have had to balance on a branch or simply hold on with its separate fingers, which were still more than capable of grasping onto a tree. But it was definitely a feathered dinosaur, whether it was a bird or not. Oh, and it had an open acetabulum, too.
Now, Sinosauropteryx, I think, was actually a dinosaur.
Yep, it was. And it was a feathered dinosaur. And we know what color the feathers were, because we have seen the melanosomes. SFT knows this, because, again, it was in my presentation.
It seemed to have a bellows-type lung. It had...
I can see why you might say that based on the original description of the animal, which concluded that there was a hepatic piston, but the subsequent paper, Anatomy of Sinosauropteryx prima from Liaoning, northeastern China, by Philip J. Curie and Pei Ji Chen, in the Canadian Journal of Earth Science, refuted that point, and that's how it stands as of now. So, no, it didn't have a bellows lung, or at least we have every reason to think that it was just like other ornithodyrans, and it didn't. And to be fair, the original paper was written way back in 1998 when the basal nature of the avian respiratory system was not well understood.
Weight on the hindquarters, and the evidence for feathers is equivocal in the extreme.
I think he said that the evidence for feathers in Sinosauropteryx is equivocal in the extreme, but the audio quality is bad. I'll just assume that's what he said, and respond with, "We know what color the thing was." This is as conclusive as it could possibly be, short of going back in time, shaving a Sinosauropteryx, coming back and smothering Sarfati with the feathers. And again, Standing knows this because it was in my presentation. Well, that's the last argument in there. After that, it's just Standing saying he's excited for the book that Sarfati and Carter wrote, and then his outro. Since I don't care if he's excited for a book he already knows is wrong, and I also do not care about his outro, instead I'm going to remind you to like and share this video, and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Also, don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're always notified when there's new Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I'd like to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above: Bent Hovind, Ian Chen, Sphincter of Doom, Chris Love, Henry Hutanen, and Bob Knob. Their support helps make this channel possible, Because as you may know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and they give this channel much needed additional stability. If you'd like to join the team, a link to my Patreon page can be found in the description, and you can join with the button right below this video on YouTube. Both groups of people get access to my special patron and member-only Discord channel, links to new videos before I release them to the public, as well as a pretty direct line to me. They also often are asked to do things like vote on new video topics. If a monthly subscription isn't something that you'd like to do but you'd still like to help out the channel, I also have a Teespring store that has Dapper Dino merch, including mugs, blankets, pillowcases, shirts, all sorts of things. And if none of those things are for you, then please just remember to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share the video. All of those things really do help the channel grow. Well, I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I don't research on that.